Hello BLE520 students, and welcome to the screencast overview for Lesson 5. At the beginning, I'd like to just explain that how I'm showing you this information on my screen might look a little different than what it looks like in student view, but again, I have to have this editing view open so that I can show you RSA information because I'm not a part of an RSA group. So it might look a little different on my screen than how you see it on your screen, but all the content will be the same. All right, so in Lesson 5, we're still continuing to look at supporting ELLs through kind of like two lenses, right? Our beliefs, our values about ELLs and supporting their work in K-12 classrooms, and then the practical component to that work as well. And so in this lesson, you're going to read from two different areas. You're going to continue reading the SIOP book, chapters 4 and 5, which is going to help us think about those pedagogical, practical implications for supporting ELLs through content area instruction. And we're going to look at comprehension strategies, how to make sure ELLs can understand, what's expected of them, what they're learning about, and then comprehend how they have to show what they've learned. So comprehensible input across a lesson. We're also going to read from chapter 5 about strategies that we might implement into lessons to support the learners that are in our room. And then when it comes to kind of like the beliefs and our ideals about supporting ELLs in the classroom, we've got two articles for you to read this week. The first is an article called Examining Our Beliefs and Practices Through Inquiry. And this lesson is, this article is an interesting kind of jumping off point from an article that we read 2 lessons ago called Walking into the Unknown, right? Using inquiry with ELLs. But instead of the idea of using inquiry with students, this is about, inquiring about our personal practices in the classroom as educators. And it's going to ask you to really think about, as you make changes, as you reflect on the work that you're doing as an educator and make changes to your practice, are those changes just a change in action, or are those changes a change in a belief system? And so you can think about those things as you read that article. And then the other article, How Content Teachers Interact with English Language Learners, is a great chance for us to reflect on our own interaction practices in the classroom and the moves we make as educators to either involve ELLs in class discussions or maybe give them space to not be involved, and how those intentions are viewed from the student's perspective as well as from the teacher perspective. And this is going to be a great foundational piece for readings from the SIOP book that we'll read next lesson when we'll get into the SIOP chapter on interaction. So when it comes to your work for this lesson, you can choose for your reading reflection to respond to one of these 2 articles. So please read them both, see which one resonates most with you, which one you have the most connection to, the most questions about, the most response to, and then use one of the 2 articles for your reading reflection this week. You'll also have a chance to view a PowerPoint presentation specific to this 2 SIOP chapters, which is going to be very handy in thinking through some of the ideas that you're going to be using and applying in your RSA assignment this week. And so continuing the work with our lesson plan, in Lesson 5, you are going to complete Part 2 of the lesson plan. So you're going to get back with your RSA group and you're going to examine what you have to include in this week's lesson plan template. And so there's a link to that right here. And the lesson plan template for Part 2 is going to ask for you to do a few things. First, you always want to go back to the parts that you've already created. So in order to move into Part 2, you want to review everything that you set that you were going to do in Part 1 of your lesson plan, because that was where you set out your objectives, you brought in your standards, and so everything else that you're going to be doing is going to be foundational to Part 1, right? So as we build Part 2, you want to revisit your Part 1, and you'll actually combine everything into one document before you submit it, so that when you submit Part 2, we see Part 1 and Part 2 together with your submission this week. Okay, so the main work for your Part 2 is actually mapping out everything that's going to happen in the lesson, right? So you've got this procedure section here, and of the 20 points that your Part 2 is worth, this accounts for 8 points of it. So almost half of the points for this Part 2 of your lesson plan is attributed to the procedures of your lesson. And so you're going to go through and you're going to note, and you can expand to more bullets, you can expand to less bullets, you can manipulate the space to make room for what you need, but you're going to list out everything that would happen in the lesson from beginning to end, right? So we talk about from the anticipatory set or the opener, how you're going to open this lesson, all the way to how you're going to close it. and then everything in between. And you can use bullets here, so it doesn't have to be complete sentences, but you're going to want to note teacher moves and student moves. So teacher will, students will, things like that. If during the lesson here, this main part of your lesson, you might also want to think about how you're going to provide students with the information they need. So is it a direct teach? Is it a reading that they're going to do? Is it a lecture they're going to listen to? A video they're going to watch, right? How are students going to get the information they need? How are you going to have opportunities for guided practice before they have to go out and do something on their own? And then finally, how will you close out the lesson? And so this portion, this procedure portion is going to be lengthy, and it should include both teacher moves and student moves as you walk us through everything that will happen from beginning to end. And then the other 4 components that you're going to include on part 2 is the homework component, right? So what would you have students do after completing this lesson independently on their own outside of class? How will you check for understanding throughout your procedures, throughout your entire lesson, right? And so you're going to want to think about when in your procedures up at the top, did you include an opportunity for, or can you sneak in an opportunity for checking for comprehension, right? Do we want to have a comprehension check in the opener? Do we want to have a comprehension check during our direct teach? Do we want to have a comprehension check in our guided practice before we go into independent work? And then once they've completed the independent work, do we need a final comprehension check? And then guided practice. So when throughout the lesson are you going to integrate opportunities for guided practice, either where the teacher can model the techniques that you want the students to use, and also they can see, maybe students can see other students, right, modeling the behavior. So when you think about elaborating on guided practice, those opportunities are probably going to come up during your direct teach and also maybe during your facilitated guided practice with peers learning. And then also to think about where in the lesson will you see students having the chance to either work independently or work as close to independence as possible, maybe with peer interactions, to not only solidify what is being taught, but also to check, did students get what I wanted them to get out of this lesson? And so to look at your procedures and see where is the opportunity for independent practice and what is that going to show you as the teacher, and hopefully it'll give you evidence for were the objectives met. So that is your lesson plan template part 2. So remember, you got to review the template, you got to talk with your group, and then work on it together, and then one person from your RSA team will submit the assignment. And there is also a rubric here at the bottom, right, so you can see how this part 2 is going to be graded. So that's your RSA. In your discussion board this week, you're going to think about ideas that have come up from both the PowerPoint materials and the SIOP book in terms of what it means to not understand the information that's around you, right? So we're asking you to think about a situation where you were not an insider and you weren't understanding what was being said, and how did that make you feel, right? So to think back on a time where you were in a situation where you were not clear on what was being said or what you needed to do, how you needed to interact in that situation, and kind of layer that on what does that mean for ELLs. And then you're also going to think about a content topic that you have to teach or could imagine teaching if you're not in the classroom right now. And this doesn't have to be K-12 specific. Maybe you're going to work with adults or you're going to work with early childhood educators or something, right? But think about a topic that you have to teach that might be challenging for students that do not understand the language of instruction, and what kind of scaffold might you put in place to help the students be more successful with that lesson. And again, as always, when you're doing your discussion board, you want to respond to these 2 prompts, but you also then want to loop others into the conversation by giving a request or a question out to your peer community so that they can read how you responded and also then respond to your questions. And then you're going to go in and respond to a few other peers too before the week's over. Okay, and then the last thing you're going to do this lesson is turn in a reflection, which you guys are getting really good at. Again, I want to give a shout out to some of the non-traditional forms of a reading reflection. Some students are doing prezzies, some are doing reading reflections, some students are mapping out in a handwritten form, a graphic organizer, or a kind of like a concept map of the readings and their questions, their responses, and uploading pictures of that work. So however whatever format you're using, that's great. But for this reading reflection, you can pick one of the 2 articles that you read and use that as the basis for your reflection. I hope you all have a great week, enjoy working with your RSA teams, and we look forward to supporting you in the class. Thank you.